Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another fun filled edition of Adam's Music Box. It's the Saturday live stream. Like I said, I'm going to try to do these once or twice a weekend. I would say more, but there's only 2 days in the weekend for those of you who didn't know. But this isn't a calendar show, this is a music show. And I wanted to start with a couple of things that happened in the world of music, well, my world of music this week, that kind of reminded me of something that sort of goes together. And that's the fact that session musicians have really done some amazing things when they get in front of the scenes. Now, a session musician is obviously someone who mostly works pretty anonymously behind the scenes. These are the people who play in the bands behind your favorite solo artists. They're on the tracks of your favorite singers, your favorite lead instrumental soloists, your favorite commercials, your favorite movie scores, that song that featured in that favorite television show of yours. And within the music industry, session musicians obviously have a huge reputation because they are some of the most talented, hardworking, and virtuosic musicians around. And they'd have to be because the demands that are put on them are very high, generally much higher than your typical touring musician or your solo artist or your band member. And there are several reasons for this. One is the sheer volume of what they do. A session musician, if he or she is successful, ideally wants to and has to work every single day, sometimes multiple sessions a day. And that isn't easy. The other thing that really makes it a grueling job to be a session musician is you have to be proficient in so many different genres of music across so many styles. You might be having an AM session doing a commercial for a car. And then in the afternoon, you might be part of a pit orchestra that's doing a score for the latest thriller film, the latest Spider-Man meets the Ninja Turtles inside Jurassic Park. And then in the evening, you could be working with Madonna or Cher or some huge sort of lead vocalist out there. It's very demanding. You have to be able to learn things very quickly with or without musical notation. If there's a full musical score, as there would be in most orchestral situations, you have to be a really good sight reader. If there's just little, chicken scratchings, little, bits of scratches on paper, you're going to have to make heads or tails of it and play your part correctly, because in the world of studios, time is money. Everyone, including the engineers, are on the clock. And if there's no music at all, but let's say there's a songwriter or a solo artist saying, well, I kind of sort of wanted to go like this, you have to know what that kind of sort of is very quickly. It is not an easy thing to be. And so the session musicians who make it to the top are some of the best musicians in the world. I was talking about Glenn Campbell, for example, on a recent episode. He started out as a session musician, and he was a guitar virtuoso who could play anything that was thrown at him. He was playing with Nashville Stars one day, in the Beach Boys the next. And of course, he then became one of the top selling solo artists of all time. But he never lost that ability to play in whatever style a song calls for. And so, for instance, while he's not known for sort of rock and roll shredding, as I said then, Google the video, and there's a few good performances of it. Google him with Jimmy Webb at the piano playing the wonderful Jimmy Webb composition, MacArthur Park. And unlike the original that was highly orchestrated, had harpsichord on it and the full chorus and everything, the version that Glenn played alongside Jimmy, the songwriter, had an extended electric guitar solo, and Glenn shreds. He's one of the best guitarists ever. The reason, well, he cut his teeth in the world of sessions. And obviously, you have to have a lot of natural talent, a lot of discipline, and a lot of consistency to do that. And this then brings me to something that a family member actually mentioned to me, that she saw a video of Toto from 2024 and that they were really good, even though they're not spring chickens anymore, but they're still great. And I said, well, there's a reason. The guys in Toto, both the original members and the various members who have come in and out of the lineup over the years, are all people from the world of session playing. The founders of Toto were on an individual basis, and in the case of the Picaro brothers, who sometimes came as a package, they were the most in-demand session players in LA, which was the center of the session music scene by the 1970s. But all of them, David Paich, Steve Lukather, as I said, the Picaro brothers, all of them, they were session musicians and they have played on so many albums, too many to name. But if you've got a favorite album by a solo act from the 70s, the guys in Toto will definitely be on maybe half of them, maybe most of them, depending on your musical taste. And one day they decided, let's just start a band. We all know each other, we work with each other in the session scene. Let's start a band together. And they did it. And the first Toto album came out in 1978, and it was a really good album. And so they carried on. They went from strength to strength. And then by the early 80s, 82, they came out with their fourth album, which was their monster smash hit that had so many great songs. The most famous of which is probably Africa, one of the best songs of all time, best written, best produced, best performed. And they continued to go from strength to strength. And Toto were a band that not only had chart success, but fellow musicians go out to see Toto. And I've experienced this. I've been at music clubs or at studios, and the musicians say, oh, yeah, guys, Toto's coming to town. And they all go. You go to a Toto concert, and the first person you bump shoulders with, he may well be a musician, because musicians love Toto for that reason. But what one of the things they did, other than writing great songs and having great hits and being so listenable, because the production quality and the execution, their playing was so good. One of the things that they proved is that session musicians aren't all generic and they aren't all stiff, because that is one of the downsides, allegedly, of being a session musician, is that people say that if you're so used to having to be perfect for other people, are you going to lose your own artistry? And there may be some truth to that with some session musicians. Look at Keith Moon, for instance, one of the most distinct drummers ever, someone who probably couldn't be a session musician if his life depended on it, because he was so spontaneous, he was so wild. He didn't care about precision so much as he cared about making a statement. I love Keith Moon, not necessarily a technician, but he knew his way around the drum kit, and he could play in time when he wanted to. Don't get that wrong. But obviously, that's very different than your disciplined guys, your Steve Gadds, your Jeff Picaros, your Omar Hakims, your Dennis Chambers, people who are your Bernard Purdy. These are people who, when called into sessions, cannot make mistakes. And they don't make mistakes. I'm sure once in a while something happens, but in general, these cats don't make mistakes. And yet, Toto showed that you can still record and write really original and interesting music, even if you come from this regimented background. And I'm not saying here that, oh, you should like session musicians and not sort of the self-taught people who are more, fly by the seat of their pants. No, I love it all. It is all valid. In fact, going back to the classical world, Rimsky-Korsakov was actually criticized by his mentor Mussorgsky when he took additional courses at a music conservatory, because the essence of Russian music at that time was to be very much in tune with the folkish and nationalistic roots of the music, rather than the refined and the academic and the studied kind of music you'd get at the conservatoire, the conservatory. And Rimsky, who grew up in that very sort of that very organic environment of what was then very contemporary Russian classical music, he then decided to get a bit of refinement, and Mussorgsky didn't really care for that in his great student. They still are very much associated with each other. Mussorgsky, because he died young and loved to drink. Who doesn't? But, well, he really did. He didn't complete a lot of his work, so Rimsky helped him to do that posthumously, and everyone had a jolly good day in Moscow. Well, it was actually St. Petersburg, which was the center of culture in Russia in the 19th century, but that's for another day. Getting back to studio musicians in the 20th and 21st century, something else happened that really reminded me about this theory that session music can have soul, it can be memorable, it can have emotive, visceral impacts in people's life. And I've talked about Alan Parsons. It was either last weekend or the weekend before, because he's doing the publicity circuit because a special edition of Pyramid with remastered audio and an Alan Parsons made surround sound mix is coming out. I don't get any money for saying that, but if Alan, you want to put me in touch with your accountant, please do, and definitely pick up that edition because all of the stuff that Alan Parsons has been doing with remastering and doing new surround sound mixes of his albums are really good. But what reminded me of Parsons again is because he did what is probably his best interview ever with Rick Beato, who everyone, if you're on YouTube watching a guy talk about music who just started his channel a few months ago, you probably also know who Rick Beato is. He's a superstar. And he did an interview with Alan Parsons, and it was great because Rick asked all of the questions that people who are really into production, really into the kinds of music that Parsons helped to create, the music he composed, the music he played on, the music he grew up on, and the technology he used to facilitate this great music. Rick asked all of the great questions. And that got me thinking of what the Alan Parsons Project really is. And what it is it's a vehicle for the compositions of Alan and his composing partner Eric Wolfson, but it was also a chance for session musicians to take part in a situation being run by a guy who, because of his status as one of the top engineers and producers of all time, he knows how to run a session. So going on a session for the Alan Parsons Project must have been an absolute joy. No tantrums from diva singers, no producers who had a different vision than you because they didn't speak the same musical language. It must have been smooth. And Alan also gave people who were well known musicians in their own right, people like Arthur Brown from The Crazy World. Gary Brooker has sung on Alan Parsons stuff from Procol Harum. He gave an opportunity from these musicians who were solo artists or members of bands, stars in their own right. He gave them a chance to be session musicians for a day or two and be on an Alan Parsons Project album or song. And I think that must have been a really fun experience for these musicians. Chris Rainbow, for instance, all over Alan Parsons stuff. And this is because it gets to put their talent in a different sort of environment, which in some ways takes off the pressure. When you're Arthur Brown being Arthur Brown, everyone wants you to put on a hat that's on fire. Because for those who don't know, his big hit was a song called Fire, and he begins his stage show by wearing a hat that was doused in lighter fluid. Someone flicked a match, and and he would go, "I am the god of hellfire, and I bring you fire." Google it, YouTube it. Great song. Carl Palmer was in that band for a while. So you know. So it gives him a chance to not have to be Arthur Brown. It gives Gary Brooker and Chris Rainbow and all of these other great vocalists and guitarists and keyboardists a chance to sort of indulge their artistry through the comforts of anonymity, because there's no one shouting at Gary Brooker, play whiter shade of pale, man, when he's trying to play other things. And so there is something to be said about the ability to express yourself under this cloak of anonymity. And the Alan Parsons Project, they were very anonymous. It almost sounds like a bridge that's being named after some sort of local politician. Oh yeah, this construction company in Baltimore, they're building the Alan Parsons Project to replace the bridge that fell down. And you know, Austin Powers has made fun of it, but there's really something to that, because when the expectations are not clearly defined, you can do what you want without having the burden of expectations. You know, if I were running for president, I might say that you don't have to be burdened by what has been. See? Making things contemporary for you out there. They don't pay me enough for this. So that's something that I think that even though Toto and Alan Parsons Project have different styles of music to a degree, there was a commonality of this perfection mixed with the freedom of anonymity. Because as David Lee Roth said, the least anonymous man in music and he'll tell you if you don't already know. He told Joe Rogan something interesting on an interview he did a few years back. He said that one of that there's something to be said about bands who are anonymous. Toto, everyone knows the songs. Rosanna, Africa, Hold the Line. I could go on, but unless you're a real music fan who loves Toto, if David Page is standing next to you at the DMV, or if Steve Lukather is standing next to you at the post office, the average person wouldn't know that, even if they know every line of Toto and it's their favorite song to sing at karaoke. The same is true with the Alan Parsons project. Alan Parsons himself, good looking guy, but most people wouldn't know him. He could be at the Burger King next to you. Does he, is he, I don't know if he likes Burger King, but you wouldn't know who he is unless you're a huge fan, as I am, or as you out there might be. And the other band that David Lee Roth mentioned was Journey. Now, Neil Sean, famous haircut. Steve Perry, quite well known. But overall, Journey didn't really put their pictures on the album covers. I think there were only maybe two that they did, and that was before the Steve Perry era anyway. They had beautiful graphics. Um, and the music itself was really about the whole being more than the parts of the sum in terms of personality. Of course, the journeymen of Journey were musicians who got their start not as session musicians per se, but behind the anonymity of another superstar, because Neil Sean and Greg Raleigh, the original keyboard player and singer before he shared his duties with Steve Perry, he was a member of the band Santana. Now, everyone knows Santana music, and everyone who knows Santana music knows Carlos Santana. But as for the rest of the guys in the band, do they know for who Michael Shreve is, for instance, great drummer? Probably not, because even though Santana was a collective, it was really a vehicle for Carlos's creativity. And so that allowed them to be anonymous. And when Journey started and Greg Rowley was singing, they were kind of an anonymous band. And even when they became the biggest band in the world with Steve Perry, Steve Perry's face isn't necessarily as recognizable as your Robert Plant's or your Mick Jagger's, for instance. And that was the point that David Lee Roth was making. The reason that Don't Stop Believing has been used in so many things, television, movies, is because when you hear the song, you're not seeing an image of Steve Perry and Neil Sean in your mind. You're just hearing the song, where he was saying, if you play music by someone who you immediately know the face, when you hear that, let's say they played a Van Halen song at the end of The Sopranos instead of a Journey song, you're not thinking of Tony Soprano, you're thinking of David Lee Roth. And I think that there are a lot of instances of this. So again, that says something about session musicians as well. And this kind of helps me segue into this other Journey story. And this is just sort of, round goes the gossip, as Focus might have said. There was an article from the other day about how this lawsuit between Neil Sean, the guitarist, and Jonathan Cain, longtime keyboard player ever since Greg Raleigh left in the early 80s, they're suing each other. Jonathan is saying that Neil has maxed out the band's credit card and buying expensive hotel rooms. Neil is saying that he's spending his own money. There's who knows what's going on. They're still on tour in North America, but they've canceled a UK and Ireland tour, maybe because they're suing each other. Who knows what's going on there? But I really do hope that they continue on doing what they're doing. Because lawsuit or no, Journey were one of these bands that really, really gave people, it was a generationally defining band. And they came out of this world of people whose sort of main co-founders were behind the scenes, standing behind a great guy, a great musician, great personality like Carlos Santana. Then they were hiding behind the album covers, and yet the music was so strong that it was generational. And that's why you hear so many Journey songs that are still parts of pop culture. There was a Simpsons episode from the 90s, back when the Simpsons were good. And I don't remember, it was an episode where something controversial happened. And then at the end, everything just turns out okay because they're standing in the public square in Springfield, and any way you want it, that's the way you need it comes on the PA, and everyone's happy. That's Journey. So hopefully they'll get an arbitrator in, which I think they have, and sort their things out. And this sort of leads me to another article I came across about the most unsessioned musician ever. If there was ever someone who had none of the characteristics of a session musician, it was one of the greatest guys to ever put on a bass guitar. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, it's of course Lemmy, the face and the sound of rock and roll music. Interesting about Lemmy, and I kind of admire this because the term has become so it's become so top loaded, if you know what I mean. It carries stereotypes that distract from the music. He never liked being called a heavy metal musician. He just said this is rock and roll. And Lenny is he is the embodiment of rock and roll. And so I came across a story that a friend sent me. So thank you to the friends out there, and keep the comments coming. I appreciate all of the comments, even some of the snide ones. It's good for the channel, so keep those going too. But most of them are really cool and really fun. And so apparently, there's been a recreation of Lemmy's dressing room at the Bloodstock Heavy Metal Festival in England, in Derbyshire, for those who are familiar. And it's got the fruit machine, the little gambling machine he traveled with, and the permanent one was, of course, at his home. Frank, I would say home away from home, but it was really his home, and that was the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset Boulevard in West Hollywood. Lemmy really was only in three places. He was either on the road, at the Rainbow, or at his very small apartment just behind the Rainbow in West Hollywood that was filled with Second World War memorabilia, and not room for much else. He never bought himself a big rock star house, but he was still the quintessential rock star. He was a deeply philosophical man. And while a lot of the music is just about rocking hard, listen to the song 1916 from the early 90s that talks about the Battle of the Somme, one of the most tragic battles in a very tragic war. Was one of the first musicians, this was in the 90s, to talk about the trauma of children who have had something occur to them that YouTube will not let me talk about. But he stood up for children and gave them a voice at a time when the mainstream media and their ilk were not doing so. His interviews show a very, pardon me, I'm sounding like Lemmy now, a very deeply philosophical man with so much to say about life. And I'm glad that so many of the Motörhead albums are now getting reissued, because a lot of them were mastered hastily. They never had big budgets, but they really ought to sound as good as they can. A lot of that's now happening. And there was a bust made of Lemmy that is also apparently on tour at Bloodstock. And for those who visit LA at the Rainbow, there's actually a wonderful life-size statue of Lemmy at the bar, right near to the little gambling machine, the little fruit machine, as they call it, that he used to play. I mean, there's just something about Lemmy that, if you want to know someone who just lived the rock and roll lifestyle, but without the pretense, without the bullshit, on tour, at the bar that was his home, and then, having a place behind the bar to sleep at the times that he wasn't on tour. And when people talk about Motorhead's musical legacy, I think the legacy is really one of taking rock and roll from its sort of origins in the 50s and really bringing it into the modern era by playing it faster, turning it louder, but retaining that spirit of let's be rebels. Let's not take shit from anyone. Let's be individuals. Let's be open minded, but not at the expense of maintaining who we are. Let's be proud of what we do, but let's be willing to entertain all sorts of other psychological and philosophical possibilities. And let's make your eardrums bleed. And Motorhead accomplished that better than, frankly, any other band in sort of that post 50s, early 60s era. It's the kind of thing where, yeah, the hair was longer. It was the leather jackets were meaner. The tempi were faster. But there is really a clear link between someone like Bill Haley and the Comets of Rock Around the Clock and See You Later, Alligator fame, and what Motörhead and Lemmy did. So it's always nice to see Lemmy being honored. He wasn't the kind to really care about honor, but it's for the rest of us. It's for us to celebrate the life and the legacy and the imagery and the music of someone that really meant a lot to us. And then, of course, there's the Midnight Special, which I've done a video on before, but apparently we're right around the corner of the anniversary of its first episode. For those who don't know, the Midnight Special was a long form music show that NBC TV in the US started broadcasting in 1972, hosted by the great great AM DJ who was later syndicated on FM, the great DJ, one of the greatest of all, the granddaddy of them all, Wolfman Jack. And what's so great about that show is the amount of musical variety, musical diversity that they have. The last night's episode, well, last night's 1974, but what they've been doing is they every Friday, late afternoon or evening, depending on where in the world you live, they will stream a full episode that was in sequence. So when they started doing this, I think maybe a year or so ago, they started with the first episode, and every Friday they go in sequence playing what would have been the latest Midnight Special. And the one from this Friday, it had Sam and Dave. And it showed them being backed by members of Booker T and the MGs, who were the house band at Stax Record. You had Donald Duck Dunn, one of the best bass players ever, with pipes sticking out of his mouth. And you had, of course, Steve Cropper, great musicians, the full horn section. Sam and Dave, vocally wonderful. They really stole the show. Frankie Avalon was hosting it. I really think that Sam and Dave stole the show, though Luke Christie did a great version of his song Lightning Strikes because he had one hell of a band behind him and the drummer was really wailing. Definitely check that out on the Midnight Special YouTube page right here on YouTube. Again, that's not sponsored content, but hey, Mr. Sugarman, if you want to give me some sugar, you know. But anyway, but that got me thinking because a lot of the live comments in that chat as it went on were all about, hey man, it's the original Blues Brothers. And it really got me thinking about the whole argument about what the Blues Brothers did. Because obviously, Soul Man became a kind of signature song for the Blues Brothers. There were two of them, just like there were Sam and Dave, which are two people. So there were parallels that people in the chat were seeing. And at first I thought, why are people more familiar with the cover band than with the original? And again, with the Blues Brothers, the term didn't really exist in the late 70s, early 80s, but the term now that they would use is cultural appropriation. Are these two comedians, a Canadian and an Albanian, are they co-opting the music of Black America? And by co-opting, the modern term would be culturally appropriating. That is to say, using music from another demographic of society and sort of making it their own without putting in the effort and then cashing in on it? Or are they promoting the music? Are they introducing it to new audiences? Are they giving it a second or a third life? And these were arguments. The language changes, but they were arguments from the very beginning. From a musical rather than sociological point of view, people were asking, well, are these guys really authentic? They're actors and comedians. They're not musicians per se. But Dan Aykroyd could play a pretty decent harmonica, and John Belushi was a much better singer than a lot of people give him credit for. I mean, he cut his teeth with the best doing impersonations of Joe Cocker that were actually pretty good. And Joe Cocker is one of the best singers of all time, and Belushi impersonated him very well. And so I've always been in two minds because I always say, oh, I wish the authentic, the original was the thing that people have in their heads. But the Blues Brothers gave life to so many musicians, primarily from that early to mid 60s era, some even older, dating back to the 50s, people like Ray Charles. And at a time when, let's look at the music that was popular in the late 70s and the early 80s. It's some of the stuff we were talking about today. Alan Parsons Project, Journey, Boston, who we talked about a while ago. stuff that was a lot more polished and was sort of the AOR that was getting away from the roots, the R&B and blues and soul roots of rock music. And so what the Blues Brothers did at a time when AOR, meaning this polished melodic rock, was king in mainstream, certainly mainstream middle class FM radio stations in America and Canada and other places, the Blues Brothers said, well, we're going to go back to an earlier sort of roots driven period in sort of rock, blues, R&B, all genres that really were cousins of one another, which was something that the Blues Brothers always talked about. And I think that that was really it was really something that actually helped the music more than it hurted. They obviously, to lend legitimacy to themselves, they had people like Steve Cropper and Donald Duck Dunn in the Blues Brothers band. And there were some other important things I think they did. I mean, when you look at in the 80s, it was an era when mainstream rock, again, getting far away from its blues roots. Your Def Leppards, for instance, even your Van Halens, who started in the 70s, they were getting a bit disconnected from the blues roots of rock. And certainly the sort of Duran Durans of the era, your Flock of Seagulls, your Depeche Modes. And yet the 80s was a decade when blues started to get revived. You had Robert Cray having major hits with the Robert Cray bands. Strong Persuader, great album. You had Stevie Ray Vaughan become a superstar. You had a blues-based band like the Fabulous Thunderbirds, Ain't That Tough Enough? And I wonder how much of the success those artists had was owed to the Blues Brothers. And I wonder if the Blues Brothers really did help a lot of the artists that they paid tribute to and who starred in the film to have a second life. So again, there's always two sides to this. It was appropriation of music that other people from a different culture created. But at the same time, they used the platform they had as successful comedians and actors to make an entire film that promoted and featured and expressed reverence to music that wasn't really getting much airtime in that period, late 70s, very early 80s. So while at first I thought in reading that chat, oh, come on, this is Sam and Dave. The Blues Brothers were paying tribute to them. But that made me think, that actually, at the end of the day, made me appreciate the Blues Brothers even more, because that means people of whatever age, but they could well be people not around during Sam and Dave's first run to fame in the 60s. They know about this great music because of an iconic comedy duo that made a classic film, that went on tour, that were on TV on Saturday Night Live doing this music, doing this act. And I thought, let's have more musicians that pay tribute to existing older styles of music and other artists by incorporating that into a dramatic or comedic act. Let's have more of that. So on the whole, I think the Blues Brothers were a really good thing for music, and they certainly really wanted to pay tribute to it. What George Carlin said about the House of Blues, now a corporation not only so far removed from the blues itself, but even from Dan Aykroyd's original vision, yeah, Carlin got that right. But the stage act and the film, I think, did a lot more good than harm. But let me know what you think in the comments. And remember, the only way to help a channel grow is to like, subscribe, share it with all of your friends. There's a Ko-Fi link in the description for those of you so inclined. And feel free to suggest things that we can all talk about together, because I'm always open to new ideas. Like a session musician, I am here to serve. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.